At exactly 12:47 a.m., under a cold, silent sky at the southern border, J.D. Vance witnessed something that no camera ever captured. A side of Donald Trump no one ever imagined. There were no speeches, no spotlights, just tears glistening in the moonlight. A long, haunted silence, and a single act of mercy that changed how J.D. saw leadership forever. Why did Trump choose to keep this hidden? What drove a man known for strength and defiance to quietly kneel beside a frightened child, to whisper words meant for no one else's ears? And tonight, we invite you to see what was never meant to be seen, and to ask yourself, could this be the moment that reveals the true weight of power? Before we begin, a brief note. While this story is a dramatized account inspired by real figures and real emotions, the scenes you're about to explore are fictional. But the questions they raise, the reflection they inspire, those are as real as the choices we face as a nation. This is a story not of politics, but of humanity, courage, and the quiet moments that define who we truly are. Let's uncover the truth. Take this journey with us and discover what true power looks like when no one is watching. The night was heavy, as if the weight of the entire nation had sunk into the walls of the White House. Beyond the thick glass of the cabinet room windows, distant voices echoed. Thousands gathered in the cold, their chants rising like a storm swelling just beyond reach. Do the right thing. Enough lies. We are watching. The sound wasn't just noise. It was fury. It was fear. It was America holding its breath on the edge of fracture. Inside, the tension was thick enough to taste, like metal on the tongue. The cabinet room glowed under harsh overhead lights, washing out faces drawn tight with exhaustion and frustration. Papers littered the polished table, reports, draft statements, intelligence memos. None of them offered solutions. Around the table, voices clashed. The Homeland Security Secretary's measured tone was cut through by the raw urgency of the Chief of Staff. Advisors leaned in, their words sharper than the cold outside. And at the head of it all, President Donald Trump sat, unmoving. His face was a mask of steel, eyes fixed ahead, jaw clenched so tight it seemed carved from stone. To the world, he was the man of unshakable strength. But J.D. Vance, seated 2 chairs down, watching not just the president, but the man beneath, noticed what the cameras would never see. A hand resting on the table trembled ever so slightly before it curled into a fist. A breath too deep, forced down too quickly, so it emerged as a soft sigh nearly lost beneath the arguing. A blink that lasted just 1 heartbeat longer, as if the weight of closing his eyes offered brief shelter from the storm outside. And within, J.D.'s mind raced. Is this strength, or is he breaking? The question echoed louder than the shouts from the streets. The immigration debate wasn't new, but tonight felt different. The country wasn't just divided. It felt on the verge of something irreversible, and J.D. could feel it in his bones. The president was carrying not just policy decisions, but the crushing knowledge that whatever they chose tonight could define him, and perhaps doom him. A fresh wave of shouting erupted at the table. Arguments over border protocols, emergency powers, political consequences. J.D. barely heard the words anymore. His focus stayed on Trump, the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his gaze flickered once to the window, as if listening to the voices outside. In that fleeting glance, J.D. saw it. Not defiance, not disdain, but fatigue. The fatigue of a man trapped between the image he had built and the cost of upholding it. And then, something even more unexpected. As one advisor slammed a fist to the table, demanding swift action, J.D. saw Trump's fingers, those famous hands so often clenched in fists of power, drift for a second toward the edge of his chair, gripping it as if steadying himself. A private gesture of anchoring no one else seemed to notice. The room's arguments blurred into static. J.D.'s inner voice grew louder. What are you carrying that no one sees? And how long can you bear it? Outside, the crowd roared louder. The building seemed to vibrate with it. And in that moment, J.D. felt the first flicker of something that would not leave him. A sense that tonight wasn't about politics anymore. It wasn't about immigration, approval ratings, or press coverage. It was about what happens when the weight of a nation settles on one man's shoulders and that man begins to bend. What JD didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that this night, these signs of strain were only the beginning. The choice Trump would make before dawn would shake the very soul of the nation, and JD would be the sole witness to the truth beneath the mask. And then, just as the room seemed ready to explode beneath the weight of its own fury, it happened. Without a word of warning, Trump pushed back his chair, the screech of its legs against the polished floor, slicing through the noise like a blade. The room fell into stunned silence. All eyes turned to him, but he didn't return a single gaze. His face remained unreadable, carved in that familiar stone-like mask. But to JD, still watching every small sign, the mask looked heavier now, as if it barely held together. Trump didn't speak to the group. He didn't offer conclusions, orders, or parting remarks. He simply turned, his movement precise, deliberate. Then his eyes found JD's, not as the vice president, not as the politician, but as the man who had seen what no one else had seen in that room tonight. And in a voice low, firm, carrying the weight of decision, yet wrapped in the quiet of exhaustion, Trump said, "Ride with me, no questions." There was no moment to hesitate, no time for JD to weigh the request. The president was already walking, his steps echoing down the corridor. JD rose, his heart thudding, torn between duty and curiosity, between loyalty and unease. The air in the cabinet room still buzzed with tension, but JD no longer heard it. His world had narrowed to the sound of those footsteps, leading him into the unknown. The corridors of the White House felt different now. Shadows seemed deeper, the night silence pressing closer. Staffers paused and stared, unsure whether to speak, but Trump's pace never faltered. They exited through a side entrance, where an unmarked black SUV waited, its windows dark as the sky above. No motorcade, no lights, just the quiet hum of the engine and the scent of cold night air. JD slid in beside him, the door shutting with a soft finality that felt almost like a seal on whatever this moment was about to become. The vehicle pulled away, gliding through the Capitol's empty streets, headlights cutting through patches of fog rising from the asphalt. The city that had raged with protest hours before now seemed abandoned, ghostly, as if holding its breath for what came next. Inside the SUV, silence reigned. JD glanced at Trump, waiting for words for explanation, but none came. The president stared ahead, his hands clasped, his posture rigid, his gaze distant, not fixed on the road, but somewhere far beyond it. There was no trace of the forceful, defiant figure the cameras knew. What sat beside JD now was a man burdened by unspoken truths, his silence louder than any speech he had ever given. JD's mind raced, questions tumbling over one another. Where are we going? What does he want from me tonight? Why this secrecy? But he kept his silence, sensing that to break it would shatter something fragile in the air between them. Something that felt like trust, or maybe confession not yet spoken. The streets blurred past. The Capitol dome appeared, glowing faintly in the distance, then faded from view as they turned south. Away from the monuments, away from the heart of power, into the deeper shadows of the city. JD felt the weight of the night settle in his chest, the gnawing certainty that this journey was not political. It was personal, and whatever truth waited at the end of it, he was no longer sure he was ready to face it. The SUV moved deeper into the night, the city's lights fading behind them like dying stars. Inside, the silence had grown heavier, thick with unspoken truths. JD sat still, the rhythm of the tires on the road filling the space where words should have been. And then, just when he thought the night would remain sealed in quiet, Trump spoke. Not with the commanding tone the nation knew, but with a softness that made JD's breath catch. "They see me as stone," the president said, his voice low, almost as if he were confessing to the dark. "But every stone has cracks." JD turned slightly, watching him not as the vice president watching his president, but as a man witnessing another man's private fracture. There was no audience here, no cameras, no staff scribbling notes. Just two figures in the shadows of power, carried forward by the hum of the road and the weight of what wasn't said. Trump didn't look at JD. His eyes stayed fixed ahead, as if afraid that turning would let the cracks show too much. The moonlight, filtering through the glass, touched his face just enough for JD to see the tension at his brow, the tight line of his mouth. A man who had built a fortress of strength, now quietly admitting, in his own way, that the walls weren't as unbreakable as the world believed. JD felt something shift inside him, the sense that tonight, whatever was unfolding, would mark a turning point in how he saw this man. Trump had been many things to many people: a fighter, a symbol, a lightning rod, a shield. But here now, he was none of those. He was simply human. And somehow, that made him more formidable than ever. The vehicle continued south, the buildings thinning out, the streets empty. The weight in JD's chest grew heavier, a knot of questions and realization. He thought of all the moments he'd watched Trump command a room, defy critics, stand unyielding against waves of condemnation. And yet what stayed with him most now was this quiet admission, these few words offered in the dark. Every stone has cracks. JD sensed that this wasn't just a statement about Trump. It was a message to him, a door opening between them, unguarded, unplanned. The president wasn't asking for sympathy. Trump would never do that. But he was offering trust in the only way he knew how. And JD felt the responsibility of that trust settle over him like a mantle. He no longer felt like the vice president, the political partner, the man expected to strategize and defend. In this moment, he was just JD, a witness, a confidant, a fellow traveler in a night that felt more like a reckoning than a ride. The bond between them deepened, unspoken but undeniable, forged not in victory speeches or policy battles, but in the vulnerable quiet that power so rarely allows. Outside, the landscape darkened further, the hum of the engine steady beneath them. JD stared ahead into the unknown, heart heavy, mind racing, and for the first time in their journey together, he felt he was being allowed to see beyond the armor, to glimpse the man, not the myth. Whatever awaited them at the end of this ride, JD knew one thing. This night would change him, and perhaps in ways neither of them could yet see, it would change history too. The city fell away behind them, its glow shrinking into the rear view as the SUV sped into the night. The monuments, so grand and solid by day, now seemed distant ghosts, their outlines blurred in the mist rising from the Potomac. The hum of the tires on asphalt became the only sound, steady and hypnotic. Moonlight bathed the highway in a pale glow, casting long silver streaks across empty roads. Gas stations stood dark and deserted, their signs flickering or dead, like sentries abandoned at their posts. Fields stretched on either side, vast and quiet, their emptiness pressing against the glass as if to remind the two men inside just how alone they were on this road. JD stared out, the landscape rolling past in shades of gray and black, and felt the weight of memory settle on him. He thought of all the miles they'd traveled together, not just on roads like this, but through campaigns fought city by city, county by county, through battles waged in debate halls and behind closed doors, through victories that had felt hard-won and moments that had tested every ounce of loyalty and resolve. Yet nothing in all those miles had felt as strange, as heavy as this silent journey south into the unknown. His mind churned with questions, but none that he dared voice. What was this night really about? Where were they going? And why had Trump, a man so fiercely protective of his image, chosen to let him see beneath the armor tonight? JD knew better than to break the silence too soon. The air between them was fragile, a quiet forged in shared weight, not words. The SUV glided forward, the city lights gone now, the highway stretching like a ribbon into the darkness. Time seemed to slow, the rhythm of the ride lulling and tense all at once. JD shifted slightly, glancing at Trump, who remained motionless, gaze fixed ahead, as if watching something only he could see. The president's face was hard to read in the dim interior, but there was a stillness to him now that felt different. Not the stillness of defiance, but of reflection. And then without turning, without warning, Trump spoke. His voice was quiet, but it filled the space as surely as any roar. "You think you know me," he said, each word deliberate, almost tired. You don't. The words hung there, stark against the hush of the ride. JD felt them land, not as an accusation, but as a statement of simple, raw truth. He let them settle before he answered. But there was no answer that felt right. Because in that moment, JD realized Trump was right. He didn't know him. Not fully. No one did. They'd all seen the public man, the fighter, the symbol, the storm. But this quiet, this broken edge beneath the strength, this was something else entirely. Outside, the highway unfurled endlessly, the moon casting its pale witness on their passage. JD kept his gaze forward now, understanding that tonight wasn't about questions or answers. It was about seeing, truly seeing, and knowing that whatever waited at the end of this road would change more than his understanding of Donald Trump. It might just change his understanding of himself. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the hum of the tires a steady rhythm beneath the weight of what had just been spoken. You think you know me? You don't. Those words echoed in JD's mind, louder than the night itself, lingering in the space between them like an unfinished thought. He watched Trump's reflection in the window, the strong profile, the lines carved deep by battles no one else had fully seen, and the eyes that, even in their stillness, seemed haunted by the invisible ledger of choices made and consequences borne. For long minutes they rode without another word. Then in that same quiet tone that seemed to belong not to the president, but to the man beneath, Trump spoke again. The weight of decisions, it doesn't show on camera. His voice was not bitter, not defensive. It was a simple statement of fact, as heavy and as certain as the dark highway they traveled. JD felt the truth of it settle over him like a cold wind. He had stood beside Trump through victories and storms, watched him face down critics, deflect attacks, command rooms where the stakes were measured in lives and futures. But the cameras had never captured this, the cost written in the tightness of his jaw, the weariness that no speech could hide forever. JD realized in that moment that there were burdens no headline could tell, no photograph could reveal. And then came the question, direct, unflinching, a challenge wrapped in quiet. Would you carry it? Could you? JD felt his breath hitch, not from surprise, but from the sudden, stark clarity of the moment. Trump wasn't asking as president to vice president, nor as leader to deputy. He was asking man to man, weight bearer to weight bearer, as if passing an invisible torch for JD to feel its heat, its heaviness. JD didn't answer immediately. His mind raced, not with rehearsed lines or political calculations, but with raw, searching doubt. Could I? He thought of the campaign trail, the speeches, the handshakes, the promises made beneath banners and bright lights. Those moments had felt like leadership. But this was something else entirely. This was the loneliness of command, the sleepless nights haunted by what-ifs, the knowledge that every decision carved a mark on the soul, invisible to the world but never to the man who made it. The SUV sped on, the landscape outside turning to deeper shadow as fields gave way to open land, and the horizon seemed to fall away into night. JD stared ahead, the president's question still ringing in his ears. Would you carry it? Could you? Could he bear the weight of choices that would never be understood, the price paid in silent moments like this one? He swallowed hard, feeling the magnitude of what Trump had laid before him, not just as a question, but as a mirror. The night, the journey, the silence. All of it now felt like a test, not of loyalty, but of conscience. And for the first time, JD wondered if his image of himself, of what it meant to lead, had been far too small. Outside, the road continued south, drawing them both deeper into the unknown. Not just the land ahead, but the truths neither man had fully dared to face until now. The road seemed endless, the night deeper with each passing mile, until at last the SUV slowed, the hum of tires softening as gravel crunched beneath them. JD felt the subtle shift, the vehicle pulling off the main highway onto a narrow, uneven path. The headlights swept across dry earth, patches of scrub, and what at first seemed like emptiness. Then, shapes began to emerge from the dark. Low structures cobbled together from tarps and plywood, fires flickering low, the shadows of people huddled close to one another for warmth. The SUV rolled to a stop, the engine falling quiet, and the world outside pressed in. JD felt it before he fully saw it. The cold that seeped through the glass, sharp and biting at his skin the moment the door opened. He stepped out, the chill wrapping around him, and the air hit his nose thick with the smell of wood smoke, damp earth, and something harder to name. Despair, maybe, or fear that hung invisible but heavy. The camp stretched out before him, cloaked in darkness but alive with quiet sounds. The crackle of small fires, the soft sobs of children too tired to cry loudly. The low murmur of voices speaking in tones meant to soothe or calm or simply endure. JD took it all in. The way the wind seemed to cut through every layer of fabric and skin. The way people pulled closer together, not just for warmth, but for the fragile sense of safety that closeness brings. His eyes adjusted to the gloom, and the details sharpened. A woman cradling an infant beneath a thin blanket. Rocking slowly, a boy no older than 10 staring out at the SUV, his face streaked with dirt and something harder. The early lines of worry carved too young. There were no signs, no banners, no declarations of cause or claim. Just people, caught in a moment between what they had fled and what they hoped might come. Trump stood beside him now, silent, his breath visible in the cold night air. JD turned to him, searching for the words that might make sense of this, but none came, and Trump didn't offer any. Instead, his gaze swept over the camp, so not with the detachment of a man inspecting, but with the weariness of one who had seen too much and knew he would never see enough to make it right. JD felt the shift inside him, that final click of understanding. This wasn't politics. This wasn't about strategy or statements or optics. Trump hadn't brought him here to plan or spin or decide policy. He had brought him here because this was personal, because beneath the layers of power and defiance and myth, there was still a man who carried the weight of these faces, these lives in ways no one would ever see on camera, no matter how closely they watched. The fires flickered, the night pressed in closer, and JD stood in the quiet alongside the president. The two of them bound in that moment by the simple, brutal truth of what lay before them. Whatever came next, JD knew he would never see the office, the man or himself the same way again. The air felt colder as they stepped deeper into the camp, as if the night itself had thickened around them. Gravel crunched softly beneath their boots, the only sound apart from the low crackle of fires and the occasional rustle of wind pulling at loose fabric. JD walked a step behind Trump, his breath visible in the chill, his heart pounding not from fear, but from the weight of what he saw, and what he felt he was only beginning to understand. There were no cameras here, no reporters trailing at a safe distance, no lenses to capture and frame the moment for headlines, no staff to script or stage, just raw humanity, stripped bare beneath the stars, the kind of truth too messy and painful for news cycles to hold. JD's eyes moved from face to face, each one etched with its own silent story. A mother clutching her child so tightly it seemed as though letting go might break them both. An old man sitting cross-legged on a torn blanket, his eyes fixed on the ground as if ashamed to meet the world's gaze. A teenager, shoulders squared in defiance, but his fists clenched at his sides, trembling against the cold and the fear he refused to show. They passed a small group gathered around a dying fire, its embers glowing like the last hope of warmth. The faces turned up to look at them, hollow-eyed, not with anger, not even with expectation, but with the quiet, aching hunger of people who had run out of questions and were too tired for answers. JD felt their gaze land on him, not seeing the office he held, not caring about the title or the power. They saw only two men who could walk freely where they could not, two men who would leave when the night was done. His heart ached at the sight, the way the children clung to their mothers, the way the men stood slightly apart, as if trying to shield their families from a world that had already taken too much. The way even in the dark, people's eyes darted toward the edge of the camp, as if still hoping to see a savior coming down the road, and fearing instead whatever might come next. JD had seen desperation before, in rallies where promises were made, in hearings where truths were argued over like possessions. But this was different. This was desperation that no speech could touch, no policy could ease in a single night. Trump walked slowly, silently, his gaze steady, his hands at his sides. Not clenched, not raised, just still. JD watched him out of the corner of his eye, searching for some sign of the man the world thought it knew. But there was no performance here, no swagger, only quiet, only weight. The president stopped once, glancing at a small boy sitting alone near the edge of the camp, knees pulled to his chest, eyes wide and unblinking in the dark. JD felt the urge to speak, to offer some word that might soften the moment, but he didn't. Somehow, words felt too small. The camp breathed around them, fire sputtering, wind sighing, the low murmur of voices trying to fill the void of uncertainty. JD and Trump stood among the forgotten, and for the first time in a long time, JD felt that he was seeing the world, and this man beside him, without the filter of politics or power. Just two men, and the truth that surrounded them. The camp's breathless quiet wrapped around them as they moved deeper. The night growing colder, the fires fewer and farther between. JD kept his gaze moving, absorbing every detail, the way the wind tugged at tattered blankets, the glint of fear that lingered in the eyes of those too exhausted to speak. And then Trump stopped. JD felt it before he saw it, that subtle stillness in the man's frame, the kind that meant something had pierced through the armor. There, in the shadows cast by a flickering flame, was a girl. Small, no more than 7, her knees pulled tightly to her chest, her thin shoulders trembling beneath a threadbare coat. Her face was streaked with dirt, her dark eyes wide with terror, unblinking, as if she feared that even moving might draw harm. She looked at them without truly seeing, as though the night itself had become too much to bear. JD froze, watching as Trump stepped forward slowly, his posture low, his movements deliberate, careful not to startle. The man who had commanded rooms with thunderous certainty, who had stared down cameras and critics alike, now knelt quietly in the dust beside this child. The flicker of firelight caught the edges of his face, softening features the world had long painted in harsh lines. Trump didn't speak right away. He simply lowered himself to the child's level, letting the silence stretch, letting the moment breathe. Then his voice came, not the voice of the president delivering declarations, but of a man speaking to one small, frightened soul. "You're safe tonight." The words were barely above a whisper, but they carried through the cold, clear as the night sky above them. With a hand that JD saw tremble, just for a second, Trump reached out and wiped a tear from the girl's cheek. The child flinched at first, then stilled, her eyes locked on his as if trying to decide whether to believe him. And as Trump's fingers brushed away the tear, JD saw it, the wetness at the corner of the president's own eyes, a sheen that caught the light before he blinked it away. JD felt his throat tighten, felt the cold sting his own eyes now. Though whether from the night air or the sight before him, he couldn't tell. His instincts warred within him, the part of him trained to protect the privacy of moments like this, and the part that knew, with painful certainty, that no one would ever believe what he was seeing if it wasn't recorded. His hand, almost without thinking, moved to his phone, and he lifted it slowly, quietly, the screen's faint glow hidden by his coat. He began to record, not for politics, not for history's stage, but because this moment deserved to be remembered, to be seen, because it revealed something no speech or act of policy ever could. "This isn't the man I thought I knew," JD thought, heart pounding, breath caught between sorrow and awe. And maybe it never was. The night seemed to hold its breath with him, the fires flickering low, the wind falling still, as if the world itself paused to bear witness to a truth long hidden beneath stone. The girl's eyes slowly drifted closed, exhaustion overcoming fear at last. Trump remained kneeling beside her for a moment longer, his hand lowering to rest gently on the dirt, as if anchoring himself to the earth beneath them. Then without a word, he eased down fully, sitting there on the cold, hard ground, legs bent, elbows resting on his knees, his gaze lost in the shadows beyond the firelight. His breath rose in faint clouds, steady but heavy with a weight that no speech could lift. JD watched him, the silence between them thick with unspoken understanding. He hesitated only a moment before stepping closer, then lowered himself beside the president, feeling the chill of the dirt seep through his clothes. There was no ceremony in it, no plan. Just two men side by side, bound not by office or title, but by the truth of what they had witnessed, of what they carried together in that moment. The camp around them seemed to fade, the crackling fires and quiet murmurs receding into the distance, as if the world itself respected the hush that had fallen. Neither spoke. There was no need. Words would have felt hollow against the depth of what surrounded them. The rawness of the night, the quiet ache of shared grief for lives caught in the cracks of power, for choices made and choices that now made them. JD stared into the dark alongside Trump, the horizon invisible beyond the curve of the earth and the weight of the stars. The cold bit at his skin, but he welcomed it. It reminded him he was here, present, witnessing something no camera would ever capture. The cost of command, not in applause or condemnation, but in moments like this, where strength meant bearing the silence and not filling it. Trump sat motionless, his face unreadable in the flickering light, but JD didn't need to see his expression to understand. The president's stillness spoke louder than any words. This wasn't about politics tonight. It wasn't about polls or power plays. It was about being human in a world that too often forgot what that meant, about carrying the invisible burdens that came with standing at the top while so many suffered unseen below. JD felt something shift inside him, the final, unshakable realization that leadership wasn't built on slogans or sound bites. It wasn't forged in rallies or carved into history by speeches shouted over cheering crowds. It was this, the quiet, the unseen, the willingness to sit in the dirt, to face the weight of choices with no one watching, to let the silence say what words could not. And as they sat together, JD's heart made a vow, one that rose unbidden but settled with certainty. One day they'll know this man, he promised silently. One day, the world will see beyond the headlines, beyond the myths and the battles, to this truth I've seen tonight. The fires burned low, the camp settling deeper into sleep, and the night wrapped around them like a cloak. In that moment, bound by silence, by grief, by the shared weight of unseen burdens, JD and Trump forged a bond stronger than politics could ever offer, a bond that would shape all that was still to come. The night thinned toward dawn, a pale haze bleeding across the horizon where stars once ruled. The fires in the camp burned low, their glow like the last embers of hope clinging stubbornly against the cold. Around them, the camp stirred in fits and starts, a cough in the dark, the soft whimper of a child, the rustle of fabric as someone shifted in uneasy sleep. And through it all, JD and Trump rose slowly from where they had sat in the dust, brushing the grit from their hands, the silence between them deep and unbroken. Their breath hung in the air, visible ghosts in the pre-dawn chill as they turned back toward the waiting SUV. The driver stood at a respectful distance, his face unreadable, as if he too sensed the weight of what had passed in the hours before. JD fell into step beside Trump, every footfall feeling heavier than it should, as if leaving this place meant shouldering a piece of it forever. They reached the vehicle, and just as Trump's hand touched the door handle, he paused. JD watched him, saw the slight hitch in his breath, saw his gaze lift and turn one final time to the camp behind them. The president's eyes swept over the makeshift shelters, the dim fires, the shapes of lives caught between worlds. And in that fleeting glance, JD saw what no camera had ever captured, what no speech had ever admitted. The pain in those eyes, raw, undeniable, unhidden. It was not the pain of guilt or regret for choices made, but of the crushing knowledge that no choice had ever been enough. Trump blinked once, as if sealing that view into memory, then opened the door and slid inside. JD followed, his mind a tangle of thoughts and feelings too complex to name. The door shut behind him with a soft thud, and the SUV eased away from the camp, tires crunching on gravel, the world outside slowly swallowed by the rising dawn. Inside, the quiet felt heavier now, different from the silence that had filled the ride south. This was the silence of reckoning, of two men lost in the echoes of what they had seen, what they had shared. JD stared out at the empty road ahead, the landscape blurring as the vehicle gained speed, but his mind stayed behind, with the faces in the dark, the girl's wide eyes, the child's trembling hands. The way Trump's shoulders had seemed to sag beneath the weight of it all when no one was looking. He struggled to process it, the image of Trump kneeling, the whispered words, the tears. The man he thought he knew had cracked open before him, revealing not weakness, but something far more powerful, the courage to feel, to grieve, to bear the burden in silence. JD's chest tightened, his breath shallow as the memory replayed itself over and over, each time cutting deeper. What do I do with this truth, he wondered. How do I carry it? The SUV sped on, leaving the camp behind, but JD knew the camp would not leave him. Nor would the man who had shown him, in one unguarded night, what leadership looked like when stripped of all pretense. And as the first light of day broke over the horizon, casting the world in golden gray, JD realized that nothing, not this journey, not the bond forged in that place, not the truth he now carried, would ever truly fade. The SUV continued its journey north, the sky slowly brightening, though dawn's fragile light seemed reluctant to claim the world after all the night had revealed. Inside the vehicle, the silence stretched, not oppressive, but heavy with what had passed, with the weight of moments that could not be undone, unseen, or forgotten. JD kept his gaze fixed on the horizon ahead, though his mind remained tangled in the images left behind. The camp's flickering fires, the girl's wide, frightened eyes, the president kneeling in the dust, the tears that no camera would ever capture. For miles, neither man spoke. The hum of the engine and the soft rush of tires on the road became a rhythm JD hardly noticed, his thoughts louder than the world around him. He felt the weight of what he carried now, not just memories, but a truth so raw, so real, that it seemed almost impossible to contain. He wanted to speak, to say something that might honor the gravity of what they'd witnessed, but the words wouldn't come. Perhaps no words could. And then, at last, Trump's voice broke the stillness. It came low, quiet, yet carrying the full force of intent. "Never speak of tonight?" JD felt the words land, heavy and final, like a stone dropped into still water. His heart sank, not from disappointment in Trump, but from the sudden, sharp ache of knowing that this truth, this glimpse of the man beyond the myth, would remain locked in the shadows, unseen by the world that most needed to see it. He clenched his jaw, swallowing the instinct to protest, to plead for permission to share what he knew could change how history judged this man. But he stayed silent because, in that moment, he understood. This was Trump's burden to carry in his way, on his terms. JD nodded once, a gesture so small it was almost invisible, but it was enough. The president didn't look at him, didn't need to. The bond between them had been forged in silence, and it was in silence that it would be kept. The respect JD felt for him deepened, not because of the command, but because of the trust that came with it. Trump had allowed him to witness what no one else had let the mask slip, had let him see the man beneath. That trust wasn't given lightly, it wasn't given at all in politics, and yet here it was, resting in JD's hands like something fragile and irreplaceable. JD leaned back against the seat, the hum of the road beneath him, the dawn now breaking in earnest, casting long shadows across the land they sped through. The struggle inside him was real. Part of him wanted to shout the truth from every podium, to show the world the moment that had rewritten his understanding of leadership. But the greater part of him knew tonight's truth wasn't his to give. Not yet, maybe not ever. The SUV rolled on, the miles slipping away, but JD knew that what had passed between them on this night would stay with him always. Unspoken, unseen, but no less real for its silence. The SUV had long since delivered them back to the city, but for JD the night hadn't truly ended. Morning light had come and gone, the machinery of Washington grinding forward as it always did, indifferent to what had passed beneath its gaze. And now, hours later, JD lay awake in the darkness of his own room, the world outside cloaked again in night, but his mind anything but still. The television in the corner glowed softly, the sound turned low, but the scrolling headlines cut sharper than any shout. President cold. Heartless at the border. Where is compassion? JD had seen them all, heard the commentators dissect decisions made, replay speeches delivered, spin stories crafted from fragments of facts and assumptions. The news cycle raged like a storm, tearing at Trump's image with relentless fury, casting him as the villain of a narrative too easy to write, too convenient to resist. And as each headline passed, JD's chest tightened, the weight of what he knew pressing harder. He turned from the screen, squeezing his eyes shut, but the child's face met him there in the dark. The wide, fearful eyes. The way her small body had trembled. The way her breath had caught when Trump had knelt beside her. And then the president's face. The softness of his voice. The glint of tears unshed but seen. JD had recorded the moment, had captured the truth of a night no one else would ever believe. But that truth now burned in his pocket, silent and unseen, while the world outside built its case against a man who had, in that one fragile instant, shown more humanity than they would ever imagine. Loyalty warred with conscience, and JD felt caught between them like a man balanced on the edge of a blade. He had promised, in word and in heart, to keep the night's truth sealed. Not because he had been ordered, but because he had been trusted. And that trust, rare and precious, felt sacred. But now with each passing hour, with each distorted headline, each voice that condemned without knowing, the promise felt heavier, more complicated, more painful. Could he let the world believe a lie, even if silence protected something truer? Could he carry both the truth and the burden of hiding it, knowing what it might have changed if revealed? The clock ticked on, its soft rhythm matching the pounding in his head. JD rose, crossing to the window, pulling back the curtain to let the city's light spill in. Washington lay quiet beneath him, its monuments bathed in silver, the Potomac gleaming faintly in the distance. He stared out, searching for answers where none could be found. The faces of those in the camp haunted him, but none more than the man who had sat with him in the dust, the man painted heartless by the world above, the man JD knew differently now. He let the curtain fall closed again, the room returning to shadow. His conscience whispered one truth, his loyalty another. And between them JD stood, sleepless, knowing that whatever choice he made next would shape not just the future, but how he would live with himself from this night forward. Morning came hard and cold, but it brought no peace. The city awoke not to the hum of routine, but to the roar of outrage. The news broke like a wave crashing against the fragile shore of the nation's patience. A tragedy at the border. A family lost in the night's confusion, caught in the no man's land between decisions delayed and promises broken. The details blurred in the telling, but the result was all that mattered. Lives lost. Too young, too soon, too senselessly. The story swept through the media like wildfire, consuming airtime, filling front pages, igniting every screen in homes and offices from coast to coast. The images, blurred for decency, but sharp enough to wound, looped endlessly, faces frozen in fear and grief. Commentators fumed. Protesters flooded the streets once more, their voices raised in fury, their signs scrawled in anger and heartbreak. No more excuses. Shame. Blood on their hands. The nation's fury became the soundtrack of the day, rising louder with each passing hour. JD sat in his office, the blinds half drawn against the glare of cameras and reporters camped beyond the gates, their questions hurled like stones at the windows he dared not open. The television played on mute, but he didn't need sound to hear the condemnation, to feel the storm brewing beyond the walls. The headlines screamed without words. Heartless policies kill. Where is mercy? A president without soul. He closed his eyes, but the words burned on the inside of his lids just as fiercely. His mind replayed the night, not the one on the news, but the one he had lived, the one no one knew. He saw again the child's face, the girl who had trembled until mercy found her in the form of a man the world insisted could feel none. He saw Trump's hands, gentle where they were called cruel, his eyes wet where they were labeled cold, and JD's heart clenched beneath the weight of it all. They don't know the man I saw. The thought echoed louder than the shouting outside. He wanted to rise, to step to the podium, to play the recording, to show the nation the truth buried beneath the headlines. But he stayed seated, the promise of silence, a chain he had chosen, forged in trust, now tightening around his conscience with every fresh wave of blame. The choice gnawed at him, hollowed him. He watched as the world demanded answers, demanded justice, demanded something, anything, to make sense of the senseless. And all the while, the man they condemned sat hidden behind the fortress of the Oval Office, bearing it in silence as he always had, as he always would. Outside, the chants grew louder. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the force of the nation's grief and rage. J.D. rose at last, crossing to the window, parting the blinds just enough to see the crowd below, their faces upturned, their voices raw with pain. His reflection met him in the glass, tired eyes lined with sleepless nights, with the weight of knowing too much and saying too little. The crisis raged beyond these walls, but the greater storm, J.D. knew, was the one inside. The war between loyalty and truth, between promise and duty, between what he had vowed to protect and what he longed to reveal. And as the nation cried out for answers, J.D. stood caught in the quiet before a choice he could no longer outrun. Night fell again, but the storm within J.D. had only grown. The city outside glowed with streetlights and the flash of cameras, but none of that light seemed to reach the darkness that filled him. The voices of protest still echoed in the distance, though hoarse now, weary from a day spent shouting into the void. Inside, J.D. sat alone, staring at his hands as if they might hold the answer his heart could not find. And then, driven by an urgency he could no longer ignore, he reached for his phone. The call connected on the second ring. The voice on the other end was gravelly with age, but steady, familiar. A voice J.D. had once trusted on battlefields of policy and principle, long before the weight of office had settled on his own shoulders. A retired general, a man who had known both the glory and the cost of command, who had seen duty from angles J.D. was only beginning to grasp. Without preamble, without careful framing, J.D. spoke. He poured out the truth that had kept him sleepless. The night at the camp, the moment that changed everything, the promise made in silence, the war now raging between loyalty to the man who had trusted him and duty to the nation crying out for truth. He spoke of the headlines, the fury, the lies that flourished in the absence of the one truth that could set the record straight. When at last he fell silent, the line was quiet for a breath, maybe two, and then the general spoke. His words were few, but they cut to the heart of it. Sometimes duty demands truth above loyalty. J.D. closed his eyes, the simple phrase settling over him heavier than any speech or sermon could have. He could hear the weight of experience behind those words. The voice of a man who had faced such crossroads, who knew the price of choosing wrong, or worse, choosing nothing at all. And as those words echoed in the quiet of the night, J.D. felt the pieces of his own inner battle shift. He thought of the president, of the man he had come to know in ways the world never would. He thought of the promise, forged not in politics but in trust, in the rawness of shared grief. And he thought of the faces in the crowd outside, of the children whose lives might change, if only the truth were known. Leadership isn't about comfort, J.D. realized. It's about choosing the harder right over the easier silence. The general's voice remained in his ear, steady as a drum beat, but the conversation was over in all the ways that mattered. J.D. thanked him, meaning it more deeply than words could convey, and ended the call. He sat for a long time after, the city's glow pressing against the windows, the noise of the world a distant hum. The decision was not yet made, but the path was clearing, and J.D. knew the next steps would define more than just this moment. They would define the man he would choose to be. The city never truly slept, but J.D. felt as though he were the only soul awake as he stood at his window, watching the glow of the Capitol dome against the night sky. The general's words echoed in his mind, steady as a drumbeat. Sometimes duty demands truth above loyalty. He let the sentence settle, let it fill the spaces where doubt had lived. His reflections stared back at him in the glass. The lines of worry, the weight of sleepless nights, the eyes of a man on the edge of a choice that would change everything. For so long, he had clung to silence, honoring the trust placed in him during that long, cold night at the camp. But now the cost of that silence was becoming too high, not for him, but for a nation lost in fury, blinded by falsehoods, crying out for something real. He turned from the window, the decision forming with a clarity that startled him. This isn't about saving Trump, he thought, the words solid in his chest. It's about saving the soul of this nation. He felt the tremor in his hands as he reached for his desk, pulling a legal pad toward him, the blank page waiting like the future itself. He gripped the pen tighter to steady himself, drawing a deep breath as he began to write. The first words came slowly, then faster, the ink flowing as if the truth had only waited for his resolve to catch up. He didn't craft a speech to defend a man, or a policy, or a presidency. He wrote to defend the unseen, the unheard, the silent mercy that no headline would tell, that no camera had caught, except his. The plan took shape in the quiet. A national address, not a press conference with shouted questions and flashing bulbs, not a carefully staged interview, a direct appeal to the people, to their better angels, to the part of the country that still believed in compassion beneath the noise. He would show them what he had seen, not to sway opinion, but to let them judge for themselves, with eyes unclouded by spin or fury. As the words filled the page, JD's heart pounded, not with fear, but with the gravity of the choice. He knew what was at stake, his career, his relationships, his place in the halls of power. But none of that mattered now. The girl's face haunted him still, the look in Trump's eyes that night when he thought no one was watching. These truths were not his to keep hidden. They were his to bear forward, however heavy the cost. By dawn, the outline of his address lay before him, the pages filled with the words he would speak, the images he would share. He sat back, exhausted but resolute, the tremor in his hands finally stilled. The decision was made. The course was set. And as the first light of morning painted the city in pale gold, JD felt for the first time in days the calm that comes when a man knows he is doing what is right, no matter how hard it may be. The room was silent but for the soft hum of the cameras, their lenses trained on JD as he stood behind the podium. The nation watched, across flickering television screens in living rooms, on streaming feeds in offices, on glowing phones held tight in trembling hands. For a moment, JD let his gaze sweep over the room, empty but for the quiet presence of history pressing in. His heart pounded, so loud he feared the microphones might catch it. But his voice when it came was steady. He drew a breath, felt the weight of the choice he had made settle on his shoulders, and began. Tonight I come before you not as a vice president, not as a politician, but as a witness. The words hung in the air, simple but heavy with intent. JD's eyes did not waver from the camera. He spoke as if looking into the eyes of every man, woman, and child who watched, as if inviting them to step into the moment with him. In recent days, our nation has been torn apart by grief, by rage, by images and stories that have broken our hearts and tested our unity. I have shared that grief. I have felt that rage. But I have also seen something more, something I can no longer keep in the shadows. His voice did not rise. There was no performance here, only truth, offered plainly. JD's mind flickered to the camp, to the cold night air, to the girl's face. He let the memory guide him as he spoke. Some nights ago, I accompanied the president to a place unseen by cameras, untouched by headlines, a refugee camp near our border, a place of hardship, of fear, of hope clinging to its last ember. And there I saw not a commander-in-chief giving orders, not a man calculating politics, but a human being moved by the pain around him. JD paused, let the words settle, the image begin to form in the minds of those listening. His hands gripped the edges of the podium, not to steady his voice, but to ground himself against the swell of emotion rising within. I saw him kneel beside a terrified child, no older than 7, shivering in the night. I heard his voice soft and steady as he told her, "You're safe tonight." I saw him wipe her tears, and I saw tears in his own eyes. The kind that no camera ever captured. The kind that spoke of a burden too great for one man to bear alone. The room remained silent, the cameras drinking in every word. JD felt the nation leaning closer, listening, Perhaps for the first time, not for sound bites, but for meaning. This isn't about defending a policy. It isn't about erasing mistakes. It's about reminding ourselves of the humanity that binds us, even in our leaders, even in those we too easily cast as villains. I did not come here tonight to ask for your forgiveness for him or for me. I came to share what I saw because the truth should never be buried when it can heal. JD exhaled slowly, his pulse steady now, his choice made, his path clear. The lights above seemed less harsh, the air less heavy. He had spoken not to change minds but to open hearts. And as he stood there, in that quiet moment before the world's response would flood in, he felt for the first time that the weight of the truth was lighter when shared. The final words of JD's speech faded, but the weight of them lingered in the silence that followed. Then without music, without commentary, without framing or spin, the screen shifted. The footage began. No dramatic angles, no clever editing, just the raw recording JD had captured that night, his hands steady in the dark as history quietly unfolded. The nation watched. Across kitchen tables, in quiet living rooms, on glowing screens in bars and coffee shops, in newsrooms that for once fell silent, people leaned closer. They saw what no one had expected, what no headline had prepared them for. There was no bluster, no defiance, no politics. Just Trump, in the cold night, kneeling in the dirt beside a child who shook from fear and cold. The firelight flickered across his face, softening the lines that so often seemed carved in stone. His voice came low, steady. "You're safe tonight." They saw his hand reach out, trembling faintly, brushing a tear from the girl's cheek. And they saw his own eyes glisten, the tears he had never let the cameras see, the ones no speechwriter could script. The footage was unbroken, unembellished. It showed no grand gestures, no soaring words, just a man, a child, and a moment of unguarded mercy. Across the country, the noise that had filled the airwaves for days, the shouts, the accusations, the endless analyses, seemed to falter. Protest chants grew quieter, the signs lowered, not in defeat, but in stunned reflection. Anchors who had been ready with their next lines of condemnation paused, their voices caught between habit and the undeniable power of what they now saw. Social media feeds that had burned with fury slowed, posts replaced by clips of the footage, reshared not with commentary, but with quiet awe. JD watched from behind the scenes, heart still pounding, his hands folded tight before him. He had known the footage would speak for itself, but he hadn't anticipated this. The breath the nation seemed to take as one, the stillness that spread from screen to screen, city to city. For a moment, the divisions that had felt insurmountable, the fury that had seemed unquenchable, softened beneath the truth of what was shown. The footage ended as simply as it began, the final image lingering. Trump seated in the dust, silent, the firelight casting his face in shadow and gold. A man who, for that instant, bore no crown, no title, only the weight of shared humanity. And as the screens faded back to studio lights, to commentators struggling to find words that could rise to meet what had just unfolded, JD felt the tension in his chest ease, just a little. The truth was out now. The choice he had made, the burden he had carried, they belonged to the nation now. What came next was no longer his to control. Outside, the city remained unusually quiet. The chants paused, the clamor stilled. Across the land, people sat in the hush that follows when something real, something raw, breaks through the noise. And in that stillness, JD dared hope that perhaps, for a moment at least, the soul of the nation had seen what it needed most. Not perfection, not power, but simple human grace. The footage ended, but the silence it left behind seemed to echo louder than any speech. Across the nation, for one rare moment, people hesitated before they spoke, before they posted, before they judged. And when the words finally came, they were not the sharp, furious ones that had filled the days before. Social media, once ablaze with anger, shifted. Feeds no longer burned with blame and outrage. Instead, reflection bloomed, tentative at first, then stronger. like dawn pushing back the night. On timelines where slogans had shouted, now came quiet questions. How many moments like this have we never seen? Have we judged too quickly? What does it mean to lead in silence? The clip of the president kneeling beside the child spread with a force no algorithm could have planned. Reshared not with fury, but with wonder, with sorrow, with hope. People wrote not to condemn, but to confess their own surprise, their own reconsideration. For once the commentary yielded to contemplation. News anchors, usually eager to fill airtime with analysis, stumbled over their words, voices softer, more uncertain. Panelists who had spent the week dissecting motives and mistakes paused, grappling with what the footage demanded of them and of the country. The nation, so long divided by noise, for a breath seemed united by quiet. And at the center of it all, JD sat before the same camera, drawing in one steadying breath before offering the closing words he had written in the dark hours of the night when his choice had been made. His voice, though weary, carried clear and true. True strength, he said, is what we do in the dark for no one's applause. He let the words hang, unadorned, unhurried, trusting that the truth of them would find its way into hearts ready at last to listen. Then the broadcast ended, the screens faded to black, and the nation was left to reckon with what it had seen and what it now knew. The wave that followed was unlike any JD had expected. The protests, once fierce, softened into vigils, candlelight replacing placards, silence replacing chants. In community centers, churches, and town halls, people gathered not to shout, but to talk about mercy, about leadership, about what it meant to act when no one was looking, and about how often the most powerful moments are the ones the world was never meant to see. Commentary shifted. The conversation no longer centered on policy alone, but on the human heart that beats behind decisions, the weight that leadership quietly bears. Critics remained, they always would, but even they, for a time, spoke with less venom, more thought. Across kitchen tables and in late-night calls between friends, a new dialogue began. Not about party or power, but about decency, about grace, about the unseen moments that shape a nation's soul. And JD? He watched from the quiet of his office. The storm inside him eased, though not stilled. He knew the path ahead would not be easy. Truth seldom grants peace without struggle. But as the night deepened and the city calmed, he felt for the first time in many days a hope that what he had done might help heal more than it harmed. In the days that followed JD's address, the nation did what it had not done in too long. It paused to think. The footage played and replayed, not as a political weapon, but as a mirror held up to the soul of the country. The conversation shifted. Where once policies had been dissected with cold precision, now compassion entered the debate. Commentators spoke of duty not just as governance, but as guardianship. Town squares and social media feeds filled with voices not demanding victory over one side or another, but asking, what can we learn from this? How can we be better? JD took to the road, not for campaign stops, not for applause, but to listen. In small towns and big cities alike, people came to him not with slogans, but with stories of struggle, of regret, of hope renewed. He shook hands calloused by work and worry. He met eyes wet with tears, some shed in sorrow, some in relief that, at last, a leader had chosen truth over comfort. At one stop, a woman pressed a folded piece of paper into his hand, her voice trembling as she said, "For my daughter, so she'll know mercy matters." In another, a retired teacher simply gripped his arm and whispered, "Thank you for reminding us." JD felt the weight of each encounter, not as a burden, but as a bond. The people weren't asking him for promises. They were offering their trust and their resolve to be part of something better. The storm of outrage had given way to a quieter, stronger current, a resolve not born of noise but of shared purpose. And as JD listened, he felt that, for the first time in a long time, the nation wasn't just debating ideas. It was searching its heart. It was late afternoon when the call came. No fanfare, no formal request. Just a simple message. Come by. JD made his way to the White House, his steps steady, his heart oddly calm. He didn't know what words might pass between them, or if any would be needed at all. The room was quiet when JD entered, the kind of quiet that feels earned, not empty. Trump stood by the window, the city stretching out beneath the soft glow of the setting sun. For a moment he didn't turn. Then, as if sensing JD's presence without needing to look, he turned, his face unreadable at first, the familiar mask of resolve in place. But when their eyes met, the mask softened. No speeches were made, no apologies offered, none required. Trump stepped forward and extended his hand, and JD took it. The handshake was firm, but more than that, it was full of the unspoken understanding between two men who had walked a path few would ever truly comprehend. Their eyes met, and in that gaze, JD saw not anger, not regret, but respect, the kind that runs deeper than agreement, deeper than politics. Trump gave a small nod, the slightest hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth, and that was all. No need for more. JD felt peace settle over him in that moment, as if the final thread of doubt had been gently tied. He knew, JD thought. He knew I'd do what was right, and that was enough. The morning was crisp, the air carrying the scent of rain long past. JD stood alone on the steps of the Capitol, the first light of day breaking over the city. The flag rose slowly, the fabric catching the breeze, the stars and stripes bright against the pale sky. He watched it climb, steady and sure, and felt a quiet strength rise with it. He thought of the night that had changed so much, the child, the camp, the truth laid bare. He thought of the voices that had filled the days since, not with anger, but with reflection, with the start of a new conversation about what it meant to lead, to serve, to be more than the sum of noise and division. History forgets noise, JD reflected, his gaze steady on the flag as it reached the top of the pole, snapping lightly in the morning wind. It remembers mercy. He let the thought settle, let the weight of it fill him with purpose. The journey ahead would not be easy. Leadership never was. But he felt ready, not because of the title he bore, but because of the truth he had chosen, the standard he had helped set. A standard measured not in power seized or applause earned, but in quiet acts of grace when no one was meant to see. JD turned from the flag at last, the city coming to life beneath the rising sun. He walked down the steps, his stride steady, his path clear. The nation would not heal in a day, nor would its divisions vanish in a single dawn. But it would begin, and he would lead, not with noise, but with heart. This story reminds us that true leadership isn't measured by the noise we make in the spotlight, but by the quiet choices we make when no one is watching. JD's decision to reveal an unseen act of mercy shows that integrity means choosing truth over comfort, even when the cost is high. In a world so quick to judge, this tale invites us to look deeper, beyond headlines, beyond division, to the humanity that unites us. What do you believe defines real strength in a leader? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments below. If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.